Hi, my name is Josh Bryant. I'm the managing attorney here at Church General Counsel, and today I'm going to answer the question, what is the Volunteer Protection Act? Now, the Volunteer Protection Act is a piece of legislation that not a lot of church leaders know much about. We have made some assumptions over the past several years about who is responsible in the event that a volunteer injures somebody during the course of their ministry. But we need to understand that the law does not automatically place liability on the church. So let's talk about that real quick. There are four conditions that have to be met, or four elements of this particular protection that we need to talk about. First of all, the volunteer has to be acting within the scope of their volunteer service to your church. And that makes sense. They have to be doing the job that we've asked them to do or recruited them to do. They can't be operating outside of that. If they operate outside the scope of what we've asked them to do, then they can be liable, and that is very, very important, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. The second condition is that if the volunteer service that they do requires somebody to have some sort of license or certification, that they actually have to have that licensure or certification. So, for example, I would not be protected if I volunteered to come be a doctor at your church's medical clinic because I do not have a medical license to do so. You're only protected in providing medical services or dental services or some other type of service like that if you have that particular license to do that type of work. The third condition that we have to talk about is that the actions or the omissions of the volunteer cannot be in any way willful, malicious, criminal, or anything like that. Under those circumstances, the volunteer will still be liable. And finally, we need to understand that this law does not apply to the operation of a motor vehicle. So the person who's driving your church van or driving your church bus can still be held personally liable for their negligence in doing so. All right, so that's what the Volunteer Protection Act is in a nutshell. All right, it's a federal law. It has preempted state law, but it applies across the board to all courts everywhere. But what we need to understand is that this certainly informs how we can operate. The first thing I would tell you to do is go look up a book. It's called Risk is Right by John Piper, and really this is a chapter or a smaller portion of a much larger book, but Risk is Right by John Piper. And the whole premise is that serving Christ and following Christ is risky business. That there are certain risks involved in that. And so if we as church leaders and as a lawyer who advises churches can talk about how we shift the risk off of the church and back to the volunteer, then that does a couple of things. Number one, it puts us in a different category within the Volunteer Protection Act. It puts us in a position where we are helping people spiritually grow by assuming risk for the cause of Christ. And it puts us in a better, much more legally defensible position. All right. And so I think we need to talk about shifting that risk. And there are ways that you can do that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Second thing we need to talk about is how we train volunteers and what our policy should be regarding how we define volunteer positions and how we describe those positions, how we train people to do the work there, because ultimately how we do those things will directly impact what the scope of the volunteer's responsibilities are and whether or not they are operating within it during the course of their volunteer service. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. I would want you to go to churchgeneralcounsel.com, and there you will find several things. First of all, you will be able to purchase a training video. It is $4.99 that specifically walks through four different aspects of things churches can do in order to best protect themselves. So, for example, we're going to talk about the foundational issue of how the church protects itself under the Volunteer Protection Act. We want to talk about how we encourage people to volunteer. We want to talk about risk being right. And we want to talk about that in terms of some foundational documents such as our Statement of Faith, our Articles of Organization, our bylaws, and things like that. And there are all things that we can talk about in that context. The second thing we want to talk about is from a policy perspective, what do we do? How do we write policy that encourages people to volunteer, but also makes sure that we force people into this particular paradigm under the Volunteer Protection Act? And now some people would say, well, I don't want people under the Volunteer Protection Act. I want those volunteers to be responsible for their own actions. And I can understand that, but at the end of the day, I think by forcing people into and under the protection of the Volunteer Protection Act, you're going to be much more effective at ministry, and at the same time, you're going to actually lower your risk of a volunteer causing harm. We'll talk about that in that training video. The third thing we want to talk about are specific risk vectors in your church, and so we're going to take some examples of how the Volunteer Protection Act can be applied in very common ministry areas where we encourage people to volunteer. And finally, what we need to talk about are some protections in the event that the church does find itself liable. We need to talk about your insurance and things like that. And so all of that is in this training video, $4.99. Buy that at churchgeneralcouncil.com. Another thing you can buy at churchgeneralcouncil.com is a sample Volunteer Protection Act compliance policy. This is a sample document that is laid out in this same format where we're trying to push people into this umbrella or under this umbrella of the Volunteer Protection Act in order to lower our own risk liability and our risk levels, but at the same time encourage people to take on that risk themselves and make ourselves more effective in ministry. And so all of those things are covered in this sample policy. It's $2 or $3. It's not all that expensive. So you can buy that sample policy at churchgeneralcouncil.com. The other thing you can do, you can join churchgeneralcouncil.com. You can do that for $25 a month right now. That will go up to $50 a month here in the near future. But you can join churchgeneralcouncil.com. There you will have access to the training video, the policy, and a lot of other training videos and policies at no additional charge, okay? And so you'll constantly get free updates on all of these other things that are going on, all sorts of other policies, new bylaws, different provisions you can put in contracts and policies and bylaws and articles, and training videos on everything from child protection to contract negotiation and things like that. All of that is there at churchgeneralcouncil.com for $25 a month. You can even send me an email with a question, and I'll be happy to answer that for you. $25 a month. It's very much worth that investment. All right, final thing you can do is that if you have specific questions, you want me to be your in-house counsel, I can do that. It starts at $1,000 for the year. I will be your attorney for $1,000. And so go to churchgeneralcouncil.com, take a look at that, and if there's anything we can be doing for you, I hope you'll let us know. God bless.